The article selected is very similar to the scenario chosen by our group. It looks at an Indigenous male named Hader Jones who grew up around poverty and was surrounded by drug and alcohol addiction, violence and crime. At the age of 15, Hader Jones decided to run away and leave home. Hader explains in the article how his future seemed hopeless and how he thought the only place he would end up in was jail. Hader decided he did not want this life for himself and began living in homeless shelters while he finished school. He then started a career as a cameraman for the ABC. Hader would be considered today as rare. Throughout the article, his aim was to help inspire other disadvantaged and troubled Indigenous youth and encourage them not to let their circumstances define them. According to McNamara, youth homelessness has been recently understood as a major issue due to the increased numbers in Australia among particular groups. This includes Indigenous Australians. People are beginning to have a better understanding that there are reasons for this that the affected youth may not be responsible for. These include family conflict and breakdown, violence, financial stress, and lack of adequate housing. This was evident in the article discussed earlier. McIntyre, Townsend and Cullen suggest that due to these circumstances, young Indigenous people are extremely vulnerable and are disproportionately exposed to risk factors for individual problems such as poor mental health, substance abuse, crime, injury, and risks of social outcomes in adulthood such as continued homelessness, unemployment, and poverty. According to McIntyre, Townsend and Cullen, this then creates significant social problems as costs rise in healthcare systems, criminal justice systems, government assistance schemes, and community services. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare state that the government has recognised that this is an issue that is not only affecting Indigenous Australians, but the whole community. It has been understood that assistance and services are required for these disadvantaged people to help minimise the social impact. However, it is important to acknowledge that more action could be done around this issue. According to Byrne, in the 1930s, the Great Depression hit Australia. By this time, Indigenous Australians had already had most of their land taken away from them, and they were living in fringe camps around country towns or huts on government reserves. Today, these people would be classified as homeless. During the 1930s, Indigenous people suffered from loss of employment, as did white people. However, most Indigenous people were not eligible for any assistance from the government. This left Indigenous people, including Indigenous youth, in poverty. Mermont, Long and Chambers state that in this time period there was a clear distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor, whereby Indigenous people were not considered deserving and were denied access to healthcare, education and employment just based solely on their race. This notion of deserving and undeserving poor meant that governments could avoid taking responsibility for these people and therefore ignore social issues by classifying them as individual problems. According to the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, this time period also encompassed acts of the stolen generation. The stolen generation involved taking children away from homes and biological families as a result of government policies. Children were placed into institutions where they would eventually be fostered out or adopted by white families. As a result of this, there were many homeless youth separated from their families and country.
In today's society, youth homelessness is an issue that has grasped the attention of many organisations, especially when contrasted to the support offered to those who slept rough in 1930. On top of this, there are now many organisations and services aimed at the health and well-being for Indigenous Australians. In the modern day, many Melbourne-based organisations have accumulated knowledge on the epidemic of homelessness and improved and expanded the amount of help that they can offer. These organisations, such as the Melbourne Youth Support Service, Aboriginal Housing Victoria, the Homeless Outreach Sector of the Aboriginal Community Service Association, and the Koori Heritage Trust, have each grown massively over the last few decades upon learning the statistics of youth homelessness. The Department of Health and Human Services released statistics explaining that Over the last 5 years, leading to 2016 and 17, there was a 72% increase in the number of clients sleeping rough when first seeking support from specialist homelessness services. Additionally, in 2016, Homelessness Australia released that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are 15 times more likely to be staying in improvised dwellings, like tents or sleeping rough, than their non-Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander counterparts. The homelessness sector of the Victorian Aboriginal Community Services Association caters specifically to Indigenous Australians who find themselves homeless or sleeping rough. As per the Aboriginal Community Services Association, their aim is to help all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be at risk of homelessness or indeed find themselves homeless within the northwest metro area of Melbourne. Located in Northcote, 7 kilometres from Melbourne CBD, the Aboriginal Community Services Association receives its funding from the Department of Human Services and employs 2 outreach workers who devote their time to ensure that their patients find safe, affordable and secure accommodation in an effort to reduce the overall numbers in regards to Aboriginal homelessness. We believe that the Victorian Aboriginal Community Services Association would donate their time into helping the 13-year-old Indigenous boy through his adversity and, if needed, contact further assistance through a social worker. In terms of the future of this young man, there are also organisations aiming to help Aboriginal Australians achieve secure and appropriate, affordable housing as a pathway to better lives and stronger communities. This is the vision of Aboriginal Housing Victoria, a not-for-profit registered housing association. Aboriginal Housing Victoria owns more than 1,556 properties in Melbourne, making it the largest housing operation for Indigenous Australians in the country. Aboriginal Housing Victoria provides housing to over 4,000 low-income Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Victorians. It is believed that a social worker who finds themselves working with the young man sleeping rough in Melbourne in 2019 would lead him to a path of Aboriginal Housing Victoria for his future housing. Over the last 90 years, social work and human services have come leaps and bounds. It is believed that if this scenario had taken place in 1930, this young Indigenous man would not have received the same care he would in 2019. Eleanor Rosenman explains in her chapter, History of Response to Homelessness in Another Country, Histories of Homelessness, that in the early 1900s, Melbourne had night refuges where those sleeping rough could stay the night under a roof despite the dwellings being overcrowded most nights. Australia was struck by a post-war recession in the 1930s, with unemployment rising to over 30% and houses not being built. This led to many cities having tents erected where people were sleeping rough in small hand-built structures. Additionally, the organisations that would help the 21st century young man would not have been founded for many years. The Department of Human Services would be founded in 2004, and the Victorian Aboriginal Community Services Association would not be founded until 1984. In conclusion, it is believed that the conditions for a young Indigenous Australian man who is sleeping rough after having moved from Echuca to Melbourne would be far more accommodative in 2019 due to the abundance of organisations who are prepared to volunteer their time, and extreme cases like this, contact a social worker to assist the young man.
Social work role in the 1930s. A 13-year-old Indigenous man who has just moved from Echuca to Melbourne is sleeping rough. His interaction with social workers, or more broadly the allied healthcare system, can be described as being quite hostile. This might be because in the 1930s, social work only began to be recognised as more than a charitable service or volunteer work and treated as its own profession. Mary Richmond was one of many who was a pioneer for social work during and before the 1930s. She was the founder of casework and the development of scientific methodology of professional work. This would likely mean an insufficient number of social workers than what we have today, and make it unlikely that this 13-year-old Indigenous man would receive contact with a social worker despite needing one. As it wasn't until 1928 that Australia even had its own social work course, which was located in New South Wales and called the Board of Social Studies. Before this, social work in Australia was slowly progressing, with the settlement movement taking decades to establish a house and eventually moving to Darlington in 1925. Indigenous Australians were marginalised due to the racial exclusion of non-whites and mandatory assimilation despite claiming to be an equal society. This discrimination could make it even harder for the 13-year-old to get off living off the streets if people and employers are reluctant to employ him. Employment in the 1930s would be even harder and significantly more difficult as the Great Depression caused high levels of unemployment. And this blow to the economy would mean lower wages. These circumstances would have made it extremely difficult for the 13-year-old to acquire a job. However, if he did, the wage or compensation he got would likely not break him out of poverty, and we can assume he would remain sleeping rough. Outside of the social work profession itself, the bodies governing social justice were charitable organisation societies whom gave rise to hospital almas. These church officers were in charge of distributing money to the deserving poor, which ultimately failed to help those considered to be undeserving poor. The 1930s overall was an unsettling time period for Indigenous Australians, and social work profession lacked inclusive policies and objective authority. Social work in 2019, or today, the circumstances once again was the 13-year-old Indigenous man sleeping rough during just moving to Melbourne would likely have contact with a human service professional, or more specifically a social worker. There would be a significant improvement of support compared to the 1930s. In a context sense, Australia has adopted more inclusive policies and organisations. For example, the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Centre, or agency, is a statewide Aboriginal community-controlled organisation helping youth, children and families at risk and seeking housing and wellbeing support. This would be one way that the 13-year-old would be able to make indirect contact with social workers, as social workers now work with and alongside the government to make sure that these organisations are in place. Social workers today, unlike the 1930s, have its own professional representative body called the Australian Association of Social Workers. This body has its own code of ethics which guides social work behaviour and objectives. And in relation to Indigenous Australians, the AASW explicitly state in the introduction that we acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and respect their unique values and beliefs. Social workers know that there is a history of disadvantage with the Indigenous group and of people and work with the interests of them with this knowledge. Currently, social workers undergo a tertiary level or university level of education. Before completion of university, potential social workers have subjects that build their cultural competency and specifically educate on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and history. Social workers today, during their education, learn all the different approaches that could help them in their practice, as there are various methods. For example, Helms describes a multidimensional approach which recognises the uniqueness of each person's biopsychosocial and spiritual dimensions, and there are many more that are often used dependent on the situation, case-based, or agency that the social worker adheres to.
Improvements have slowly been made for the lives of Indigenous Australians. These improvements can be partially attributed to the social work profession's participation in interventions such as the Closing the Gap campaign. According to the Australian Association of Social Workers, social work professionals work alongside the Closing the Gap campaign through the provision of culturally appropriate and safe services in areas such as employment, health, education, housing, and justice. These services are aimed at addressing the divisions and inequalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Using education as an example, social work professionals have worked alongside Indigenous Australians to increase levels of participation in education. Interventions have been successful as the attainment of Year 12 education for Indigenous Australians has increased from 45.5% in 2008 to 61.5% in 2015. According to Feinstein and colleagues, completing secondary education increases opportunities for accessing resources and services, earning an income that supports good health outcomes, securing adequate housing, maintaining positive social relations, and increasing overall well-being. Furthermore, social work professionals are actively involved in policy design and development. This involves regularly gathering qualitative and quantitative information to monitor the progress and make adjustments to interventions in order to ensure they are appropriate, inclusive, and effective in improving the lives of target populations, such as Indigenous Australians. Therefore, social work interventions, which address the divisions and inequalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, have provided physical, psychological, and social health benefits, and have increased the overall quality of life for many Indigenous Australians. However, the social work profession acknowledges that more needs to be done in order to continually improve the lives of Indigenous Australians, as large discrepancies between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians continue to remain in areas such as life expectancy, educational attainment rates, employment rates, health outcomes, and prison representation rates. As a result, the Australian Association of Social Workers has become involved in an intervention called the Reconciliation Action Plan. The purpose of the Reconciliation Action Plan is to firstly recognise Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians. It's secondly to demonstrate respect for the traditions and culture of Indigenous Australians through effectively incorporating them into social work theory and practice. And finally, the Reconciliation Action Plan aims to facilitate social workers becoming adequately informed about working with Indigenous Australians in order to provide culturally competent and sensitive services. Overall, this intervention aims to demonstrate the profession's commitment to creating meaningful relationships with Indigenous Australians, whilst ensuring the right foundations for positive and sustainable long-term outcomes are built. There has also been major developments to the social work profession's role in regards to advocacy, support, and service delivery for Indigenous Australians.
The social work profession and role has changed quite significantly over time. It has realigned its focus from problems faced on an individual level towards broader structural issues. There has been a strong emphasis towards a human rights movement, and this has been adopted throughout practice. Social workers have taken on the approach of assisting persons in realising their rights and are preferably positioned to assist communities to claim their rights as a collective. Within the social work field of practice, there has been changes concerning the increase of empowerment and a move towards human rights-based practice that advances community and individual dimensions. According to the Australian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, the social work profession is built on the pursuit and preservation of human well-being. It aims to increase the progress of human capability as well as the accomplishment of human needs. In 2004, the AASW published an acknowledgement statement discussing social workers and the welfare professionals' role that they had in regards to the application of policies. This including the assimilation policies, which steered to the stolen generations between the years of 1910 until the 1970s. This acknowledgement stated in what ways some social workers enacted these government policies, norms, and ideologies of that time. This acknowledgement also stated these actions were in opposition to the ethics and values held by the social work profession in regards to human rights, social justice, and respect for peoples. The AASW advocates strongly in regards to the importance of practice of social workers in Australia to be culturally responsive and inclusive. It is now a requirement of the Australian Social Work Education and Accreditation Standards for Australian accredited tertiary social work courses to comprise of preparation and education within and towards the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities as a core syllabus element for all qualifying courses. The AASW Code of Ethics states that working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is the main obligation and objective of Australian social work practice. It outlines the ethical duties of social workers to value the distinct and diverse cultural knowledge structures, the experience lived by Indigenous peoples, and their history. The AASW practice standards outline that there are minimum standards for social workers, this including having appropriate knowledge of cultural diversity in order to work in an inclusive and culturally appropriate way. The social work profession has greatly advanced in Australia since the 1930s. Social workers are educated professionals who assist people to improve their welfare and well-being and to also manage difficulties and issues people are facing within their lives. The comparison of social workers today, who take on numerous roles to support and work with clients without bias, is significant. Social workers are employed throughout government, non-government and community agencies. They now have a broader scope of practice, which highlights what social workers are able to provide to the community in a broader context and the imperative role that social workers have in operating within communities as well as with individuals. Social workers and governing bodies are continually developing and improving their practices to provide more equitable service delivery. This is shown by the nature of service delivery becoming more inclusive and culturally responsive for all service users, with a particular focus on those who are of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent.